The last meal request comes in on a plain white form, not a phone call, not a conversation, a form. Some men ask for steak. Some ask for their mother's cooking something she made decades ago, in a kitchen that no longer exists. Some ask for nothing at all. And that silence, that refusal, tells the guards more than any words ever could. Corrections officers who work death row will tell you there is no training that fully prepares you for what the final 24 hours actually feels like. The protocol exists. The checklist exists. The schedule down to the minute exists. But the weight of what you are participating in, that is something every officer carries differently. Some never speak of it. Some leave the job entirely. A few have broken down in the hallway after, when no one was watching. What actually happens inside those final hours is not widely known. The public sees the legal battles, the appeals, the protest signs outside the prison gates. What they rarely see is the interior, the routine, the preparation, the strange and painful choreography between the condemned and the people assigned to be with them at the end. This is not about guilt or innocence. That question was settled rightly or wrongly long before this moment. This is about what happens inside the walls, hour by hour, guard by guard, room by room, and what it does to everyone involved. If you've ever wondered what actually happens behind those walls in the final hours, not the legal drama, not the protests outside, but the human reality inside, stay with this video. Because what corrections officers, chaplains, and former death row inmates have documented changes how you think about this system entirely. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Weeks before an execution date is confirmed, something subtle shifts on the unit. Death row in most American states is not one dramatic corridor of doomed men waiting in sequence. It is, in many facilities, an ordinary-looking housing block, stark, fluorescent lit, governed by strict routine. At the Huntsville Unit in Texas, which holds the state's male death row population, inmates live in single-person cells, 23 hours a day. At San Quentin in California, before its death row population was relocated amid reform debates, condemned men lived in closer proximity to one another. The physical architecture varies. The emotional architecture does not. When a death warrant is signed, the institution knows before the inmate does. Classification officers, wardens, chaplains, they are notified through internal channels. A date is placed on a calendar. Logistics begin moving. And in that window between the signing and the official notification to the inmate, the staff begins a quiet form of preparation that most people outside the system never see. Former Texas Department of Criminal Justice officer Brian Price, who worked executions and later wrote about his experiences, described the institutional shift as something felt rather than announced. Officers who were scheduled to participate in the execution or to work the unit during it began receiving their assignments. Schedules were adjusted. The Death Watch team, a small group of officers specifically assigned to monitor the condemned in the final days, was notified. The Death Watch is not punitive. It is, by design, the opposite. In most states with active execution protocols, the condemned is moved to a special observation cell, sometimes called the Death Watch cell, between 24 and 48 hours before the scheduled execution. This cell is typically closer to the execution chamber, better lit than standard housing, and under constant observation. In Texas, this transition happens at the Huntsville Unit, known among corrections staff simply as the walls. The inmate is transferred from Pulaski, sometimes hours away, to Huntsville in the days preceding the execution. That transfer is itself a moment of reckoning for men who have spent years, sometimes decades, in the same cell at Pulaski. The move to Huntsville is the first undeniable physical confirmation that the end is no longer abstract. Every prior appeal, every stay of execution, every legal motion had kept the possibility of survival alive, even faintly. The transfer closes that space. Not legally, not yet, but psychologically, the move is its own kind of threshold. Officers who conduct these transfers are trained to remain professional, calm, not cold, but measured. The inmate is shackled in the standard protocol. The ride is quiet. Some men talk. Some sleep. Some stare out the window at highway and sky and ordinary Texas landscape. Gas stations, overpasses, flat land as if memorizing it. One former chaplain who accompanied multiple men on this drive noted that the most common behavior was not crying or anger, but a strange, almost eerie stillness. A settling, as though the body, finally certain of what was coming, stopped spending energy on resistance. Inside Huntsville, the death watch cell is sparse, but not deliberately harsh. A bunk, a toilet, a sink. Officers stationed outside maintain a log, a written record of everything the inmate says and does, recorded at regular intervals. This log is not optional. It is legal documentation, part of the official record, and it begins the moment the condemned man walks through the door. The warden tells the inmate personally, this is not delegated. In virtually every state with an active execution protocol, the official notification of the execution date is delivered by the warden or a senior official face-to-face, in the cell or in a private meeting room. Legal teams are notified simultaneously. The inmate is informed of the exact date, the time, and the procedures that will follow. What happens in that room in that conversation is rarely documented in detail. But corrections officers who have stood nearby or been involved in adjacent duties have described the range of reactions. Some men had already accepted it. Some received the news in silence. Some wept. A few became agitated, not violently, but in the raw, animal way of a person confronting the unimaginable. Former Georgia Department of Corrections officer Alan Alt, who oversaw 5 executions as warden, later spoke publicly about the psychological cost of this duty. He described the notification as one of the most difficult moments in his career. Not the execution itself, but the conversation beforehand. Looking a man in the eye and telling him the date he will die. After that notification, the death watch protocol intensifies. The condemned is offered access to a chaplain immediately. In most state systems, this is not optional on the institution's part, it must be offered. Whether the inmate accepts is their choice. Many do, some do not. A significant number of men on death row have no religious affiliation whatsoever, and the system has, in recent decades, made allowances for secular counselors and spiritual advisors from non-traditional backgrounds. At San Quentin, before its execution chamber was decommissioned amid California's ongoing moratorium debates, the chaplain's role was considered integral to the final day's process. Chaplain Earl Smith, who works in Quentin for years and sat with numerous condemned men, described the work as one of witnessing, not converting, not judging, simply being present with another human being in the most extreme circumstance imaginable. The last meal request is processed. During this window, typically 24 hours, before the scheduled execution, the rules governing last meals vary significantly by state. Texas eliminated the official last meal accommodation in 2011 after a high-profile case in which a condemned man requested an elaborate meal and then declared he wasn't hungry. The state now serves the same meal being served to the general population that evening. Other states maintain the tradition, with limits usually a cost cap or restriction to items available through the institutional kitchen or local vendors. What people choose reveals something. Former corrections officers and chaplains who have observed this process describe patterns. Some men request comfort foods from childhood-specific dishes tied to memory, to family, to a time before. Some make requests that seem deliberately simple, almost as a form of refusal to participate in the ritual. Some ask for foods they know cannot be provided, a final assertion of individuality against a system designed to process them. Federal Bureau of Prisons documentation and independent academic research on capital punishment procedures confirm that the death watch period is designed with a specific dual purpose: security and humanity. The constant observation prevents suicide, which, from a legal and procedural standpoint, would circumvent the court sentence. But it also, in theory, ensures the condemned does not spend their final hours in isolation and darkness. Whether that distinction is meaningful or merely administrative is a question. Corrections officers themselves disagree on. Some describe forming a genuine, brief, human connection with the men they watched. Others maintain professional distance throughout. A small number have spoken about the long-term psychological consequences, intrusive memories, difficulty sleeping, a persistent sense of moral weight that no amount of professional training fully prepared them for. The correctional system calls this compassionate supervision. The officers who actually do it sometimes call it something they cannot name. The final night is not what most people imagine. There is no dramatic vigil, no cinematic confrontation with mortality. What corrections officers and chaplains consistently describe across multiple states and multiple decades is something far more mundane, and in many ways, far more disturbing for its ordinariness. The condemned man may watch television, he may read, he may sleep or try to. Officers on the death watch log every activity, every request, every word. The rhythm of observation continues through the night, hour by hour, entry by entry. As the clock advances toward the scheduled time dot in Texas, executions are scheduled for p.m. Most take place in the evening hours. In other states, the timing varies. Some states have used early morning hours, others midday. The scheduling is not arbitrary. It is logistical, built around the court system's need for last-minute appeal reviews and the availability of the medical personnel involved in lethal injection protocols. The morning of the execution, a defined sequence begins. The condemned is typically offered a shower, a final one, distinct from the regular institutional hygiene schedule. Officers supervise this in the standard protocol. They are present, they are watching, and for the corrections officer standing there, this moment is described by many as one of the most psychologically difficult of the entire process. This mundane, ordinary act of a person washing themselves before they die. After the shower, the inmate changes into clean prison clothing. At Huntsville, this has historically been a white outfit distinct from the standard prison uniform. The visual symbolism of that choice is not lost on anyone in the room. Final visits happen during the day if the inmate has requested them. Visitation on execution day is managed tightly. Family members, legal counsel, religious advisors may be admitted during a designated window. These visits take place in a separate room, not in the death watch cell. Officers are present or stationed nearby. What passes between a condemned man and his family in those hours, the things said, the silences, the hands pressed against glass, is not logged in official documentation. It is carried only by the people in that room. Former Warden Donald Cabana, who oversaw executions in Mississippi and later became a vocal opponent of capital punishment, wrote extensively about the experience of standing between a condemned man and his family on execution day. He described the inadequacy of language, the way the official script of the process collapsed against the reality of actual human beings in that room. Children saying goodbye to fathers, mothers to sons, partners to partners. The legal machinery continued to operate in parallel. While these final visits were occurring, attorneys were often still filing last-minute appeals or waiting on court responses. In documented cases, the executions of Henry Lee McCollum, later exonerated, the case of Cameron Todd Willingham, whose guilt remains disputed, and numerous others. Last-minute communications between legal teams and the governor's office ran parallel to the human drama inside the walls. The two realities existed simultaneously, largely without awareness of each other. The family in the visitation room did not know what was happening in the courthouse. The corrections officer logging entries in the death watch notebook did not know what the governor's office had just said. The system processed both tracks simultaneously, and the clock kept moving. What you're about to hear in the next section, what corrections officers have described about the final walk itself, is the part that stays with people for years. Officers have left careers over it. Wardens have spoken against the system they once operated. Don't click away. This is where the story gets harder and more important. The walk to the execution chamber is called the final procession. It is not a shuffle. It is not chaotic. According to documented accounts from corrections officers, chaplains, and the rare instances where journalists have been permitted to observe or where detailed testimony has been recorded. The procession is deliberate, measured, and surprisingly quiet. T. Huntsville. The distance from the death watch cell to the execution chamber is not long. The chamber is part of the same building, the walls, a red brick structure in the center of Huntsville that has stood for over a century. The condemned walks not dragged, not carried, accompanied by the warden, a chaplain if accepted, and a team of corrections officers. Their footsteps on institutional flooring. The sound of locks disengaging, doors opening and closing behind them. Former death row chaplain Carol Pickett, who witnessed 95 executions at Huntsville over 15 years, described the final procession in detail in documentary interviews. He noted that most men walked calmly. A few needed physical support, not restraint, but steadying. One man, he recalled, stopped and asked if he could shake hands with each officer accompanying him. The officers, uncertain, looked to the warden. The warden nodded. And so, in the middle of the procession toward his own execution, the condemned man went down the line and shook each hand. Inside the execution chamber, the condemned is strapped to a gurney. This process, the physical securing, is carried out by the execution team, a group of corrections officers who are assigned the specific duty. In most states, these officers volunteer for the assignment. Though the degree of true voluntariness given institutional pressures and career considerations is debated among corrections researchers, the restraints are methodical: arm, wrist, chest, leg, each point secured according to protocol, and 4-line is then inserted in lethal injection states. The delivery mechanism for the 3-drug protocol, or, in states that have simplified the method, a single barbiturate. Behind a glass partition, witnesses gather. State executions in America require witnesses. The list typically includes representatives of the victim's family, representatives of the condemned's family if they have chosen to attend, the warden, the chaplain, a physician, state officials, and members of the press. These groups are separated: victim's family on one side, condemned's family on the other. They do not see each other. They both see everything. What the corrections officers in that room experience is rarely documented with the same intensity as what the witnesses outside the glass describe. But former officers have spoken. Brian Price, who worked Texas executions and later wrote a book titled Anatomy of an Execution, described the moment before the warden gives the signal as a kind of suspended time. Everyone in the room aware of what is about to happen. The room very still. The condemned man either speaking his last statement or having chosen silence. The witnesses behind the glass. The clock. Last statements are part of the official record in Texas and several other states. They range from expressions of love to proclamations of innocence to statements of remorse. Some are long. Some are a single sentence. Some men say nothing at all. Convicted murderer Carla Faye Tucker, executed in Texas in 1998, expressed love and asked forgiveness. Gary Graham, executed in 2000, while continuing to proclaim his innocence, addressed the crowd watching. Jonathan Green, executed in Texas in 2012 for a 1985 murder, requested that his organs be donated, a request that could not be honored under Texas protocol. Each of these statements is in the public record. Each reflects something different about how a human being chooses or is forced to end. After the last statement, the signal is given. The corrections officers in the room do not administer the drugs directly. In most states, that is handled through a wall by personnel whose identities are legally protected. But the officers in the chamber are present for everything that follows. They watch. They stand at their positions. They remain until the physician confirms death, and then the room empties. The officers leave the building and the institution continues. Meals are still served on the unit. Lights out still happens on schedule. The rhythm of the prison, the counts, the shifts, the institutional heartbeat does not pause for what has just occurred. By the time the execution is confirmed and the official time of death is recorded, the corrections officers who participated have already begun the process of returning to their stations, their paperwork, their shift schedules. There is no formal debrief in most states. This is one of the most consistently documented gaps in the American corrections system's approach, execution duty. Academic research published in journals studying correctional officer psychology, including work by criminologist Robert Johnson, who has studied death row for decades, found that officers who participate in executions are at elevated risk for post-traumatic stress symptoms, moral injury, and occupational burnout, and yet formal, mandatory psychological support following executions remains the exception rather than the rule. Some prisons offer voluntary counseling. Few require it. The result is that corrections officers process these experiences largely on their own, or with peers who have gone through the same thing, and operate under the same institutional culture of silence. You do not talk about it. You move on. You come back for the next shift. Former Warden Alan Alt, who oversaw executions in Georgia and later became an outspoken critic of capital punishment, described the psychological aftermath in blunt terms. The people who carry out these sentences are themselves damaged by the process, quietly, over time, in ways the state never accounts for and rarely acknowledges. The condemned's body is transported to the county medical examiner or, in cases where family has arranged it, to a funeral home. If no family claims the body, which occurs with some regularity, the state buries the condemned in a prison cemetery. At Huntsville, the prison cemetery known as Captain Joe Bird Cemetery has held the bodies of over 200 unclaimed inmates, many of them executed. Small white crosses or markers, a name, a number, a date. The families of the executed carry their own separate weight. Research by criminologists and social workers studying the impact of capital punishment on the families of the condemned, distinct from the families of victims, documents a largely invisible population of survivors, children of executed parents, siblings, partners. These individuals are rarely acknowledged in the public conversation about capital punishment. They did not commit the crime. They had no formal role in the process. And yet, they live with the specific, unresolvable grief of losing someone to a scheduled, announced, state-administered death. It is a grief without the conventional supports. No sudden loss, no accident, no disease to explain it. Just a date on a calendar that existed for months or years before it arrived. Inside the prison itself, the death row population knew what happened. Even when the institutional routine continues uninterrupted, the men on the unit are aware. In some facilities, inmates have described hearing the activity, the increased movement, the shift in guard presence, the particular quiet of that evening. Word moves through a prison the way it moves through any closed community, without announcement, through signal and inference, and then the next day begins. The count is taken. Trays are distributed. Officers rotate through their shifts. The administration processes the documentation. A name is removed from the institutional records, reassigned from active to closed. And the cycle, which has been operating for decades across 27 states that still maintain capital punishment as of recent documented records, continues. What this process costs in human terms, across every person it touches, is not fully calculable. The victim's family carrying the original wound, the condemned's family carrying their own, the legal professionals who spent years on the case, the chaplain who sat in the cell for hours, the corrections officer who strapped the restraints and stood at their position and drove home afterward in silence. The system does not pause to calculate this. It produces a record, files it, and moves to the next case. Whether that is justice or something more complicated is not a question the protocol answers. It is only the question that remains. If this video made you think differently about what capital punishment actually involves, not the legal debate, but the human machinery behind it, share it with someone who needs to see this. And if you want to understand how solitary confinement reshapes the human mind over years on death row, before any of this ever happens, that video is next. Click it now.